Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, theater, and entertainment. And today I'm so thrilled to be joined by Espen Sandberg, who is the director of Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about this film is the very conscious choice for it to be a character study. It could have very much been an action-led film, but you really wanted to center on, the emotion, the psychology behind it, a lot of the relationships, and how did that really inform a lot of the ways that you started to think visually about the way in which you wanted to tell the story?
I wanted to tell the story about who he was because in Norway, when growing up as a Norwegian, he's like an icon, and we hear about everything he's done, but we don't get to know the man. And I was intrigued by him because he's done all these fantastic expeditions, and I read his last book, and the person there was so angry and bitter and not happy at all, and I couldn't make those two connect. So I sort of wanted to explore that. And the way I did it was, of course, we did extensive research from a lot of different sources, including the diaries of the members of his expeditions and new letters from his brother and so on. And then I structured the script so we have his brother Leon and his fiancée Bess discussing who he is, to in a way shine light on him from different angles. And I wanted all characters in the movie to have their opinion on him and that they were all right in their way of viewing him. And visually, of course, it was many ways to do that, especially through makeup. It was about 5 hours every day because he only became 50-something years, but he looked like he was in his 80s almost. And I really wanted to see that transformation and using only one actor to carry it through. So it was brutal on Paul that had to do it 5 hours every morning before starting work. But I think it was worth it. Yeah.
And with that transformation and the fact that you just mentioned that he looked significantly older than he actually was, how much of that was diving into a lot of research and really thinking about what are the specific ways that spending so much time in extreme elements would have really impacted him in a physical sense, whether it's the visuals on his face or the way that his body moves and working with him on his performance?
Yeah, it was that was one of the easier parts to see because there's so much film recorded and photographs of him, so we could very specifically see the transformation year from year. And one thing was, of course, the harsh conditions and the loneliness, but he also got poisoned from carbon dioxide. He of course didn't get all the nutrition that he needed at all times. He was attacked by polar bears, and he crash landed with an airplane at least 5 times.
And you mentioned that part of the research in the relationship with his brother was some of the letters that they used to pass back and forth to each other. But I was interested beyond those letters, how much there was to really lean into and understand the real complexities about their relationship, and how much you had to kind of lean into the ideas that the script really concocts in what it might have been.
A lot of it is factual, and between the brothers, we know about all these different discussions they had. There's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of letters, and we also got to talk to the family about this. And of course, the dialogue itself is something that we constructed. Same with Bess Maggots and her conversation with the brother. The meeting is factual. She came to Oslo right after Roald had left to find Novela. So we know that they sat there and talked together, but of course we don't know exactly what they talked about. So that is our interpretation based on all the new knowledge we have from these new written sources.
Yeah. And it's really interesting in terms of the expedition that doesn't become the final touchstone of the film. The film isn't about whether he's going to accomplish this, because we know from history and facts that he did, but really about what did that mean emotionally? What did that mean to his relationships? And you spend so much time of this venture, from the initial genesis and the spark and passion for this idea when he was a kid, to a lot of the planning and how it all came together, to the expedition itself, and then towards the end of his life as well. So in taking so many touch points of his life and the different emotional facets of what this expedition was and how it impacted him, how did you really approach making sure that all of those moments had a lot of time on screen to breathe and to bring us into this character, but yet you could still kind of like flow forward into so many different points in his life?
I think that was possibly the greatest challenge with the script. And that is why I chose the structure that I talked about, to have Bess and Leon, the brother and the fiancé, talk about who he is, and then through that create an emotional through line and make sense of it for the audience, the different expeditions, and why and what it meant, and why he became the man he became. And then, of course, 2/3 into the movie, introduce him live in the storyline. So it was a very careful puzzle, because it had to make sense, like I said, on an emotional level, which I think is so important for the movie. So, and at the same time, he did all these great things that we had to show. So hopefully it worked out.
And in terms of developing him on screen as a character, you do such a wonderful job at really thinking about what would it take emotionally, what would it take psychologically to accomplish something like this, particularly at that time. And so I was really interested in how you wanted to approach that side of him as a character, and the psychological elements that he needed in himself.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting side, because if you are able to go to the South Pole and the North Pole, and nobody had been there before, and they didn't even know quite what to expect. Of course, you have to have an extreme personality and an extreme ego, basically. And we often, lift this up, and these are amazing men and women that do this. But of course, that kind of one-track mind also has a flip side, and the price of their success is very often paid by others. And I found that interesting. I wanted to look at that part of it too. And I think he's so extreme, even next to Nansen, another explorer, because he didn't have any other hats, so to speak. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a father. He even ended being a brother, basically. So he was only pretty much left with being an explorer, and then he ran out of land. So he didn't really have much. He himself made himself poor also, in a way, which I found interesting.
Yeah. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about filming a lot of the expedition scenes within the film. And you went to Iceland to film a lot there. But I was interested in, there's a lot of lines in the film about the weather, the way that snow forms differently and reacts differently in such extreme temperatures. And so as cold as Iceland is, it's still a little bit warmer in a sense than the Arctic. So how did you take that setting and then really think about the visual elements and how you needed to enhance them, either with in-camera effects or visual effects, to really capture that sensory experience on screen?
Yeah, no, it's a lot of research that's gone into it. So we've talked to people that have been to the South Pole, which is most of what we're portraying, and of course the North Pole as well. I have friends that has been both places. And we got a lot of photo material and also video material, so we could see what it was like. And it's also different stages of the expedition. So, and you're very right, Iceland is not as cold. And it's also, the weather is changing much more in a way than it is, especially at the South Pole. So we had to do quite a lot in post. But again, as with anything we do, we're putting all this smoke and mirrors and effects together to present something that is very truthful. And it's based on actual photographs and actual takes from the South Pole, and then we've layered it in with our actors, and of course then visual effects on top of that again to portray it as truthfully as possible.
And you were just mentioning the changing weather in Iceland, and it really can change, 5 or 6 times within the day. You can get different seasons and every single season. And some of the locations that you sought out, would be covered in snow, covered in ice. And then, a day or two later, it might be that some of that had melted. So how did your locations and the way that they would constantly change, even after you'd sought them out, really impact the way that you then were working on filming a lot of these scenes?
Yeah, no, we actually had a very tough time there, to be honest. we found we were on a lake. It was frozen, and it was snow everywhere, really thick, and it was perfect. And then, of course, it started raining, and it rained away, and the whole ice on top of the lake, we had this much water. So we had actually, luckily, of course, very experienced Icelandic crew, and they drilled hole in the ice so that the ice would let the water come underneath again, and it would float to the top, and then we would have the surface that we needed to do our work. So it was very challenging, but luckily we had very skilled craft to get us a crew to get us through that.
And in essence, visually, the film almost has 2 different stylistic elements for the expedition scenes, and then, things like the conversation between his brother and between Bess and some of those other moments in the film. So how did you map out what those 2 different visualistic ways were going to be, but still really make sure that they were cohesive and all part of the same film on screen?
Yeah, it's we talked a lot, Paul and I, and we of course we wanted it to be a feeling of that and it's true all the time too. The interiors were very dark, and they were also quite crowded. They had a lot of furniture. They had a lot of lamps and plants and everything, and also that cultural codex in meeting people and every noise and all of that was kind of confusing to him. He wasn't really good at reading it, and we wanted to make sure that you only saw parts of everything when you were in civilization, so to speak, and then when we were out in nature and it was wide open, that it was a sense of freedom and beauty also in a very kind of monochrome landscape, and combining the two, of course, it has to do with the angles that we chose and the lenses and everything to try to weave it all together and make sense of it all. So.
And it's also obviously very true for the costumes as well, even just the fact that there's a certain necessity to what the costumes are going to be in the North and South Pole. So how did you really think about the color palette and design of the costumes and how they could represent these 2 different spaces, but again, with that cohesiveness between the film?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually what it was. We basically copied it. We've made certain changes to his wardrobe to make him sure that he looked like what he looked like physically. So Paul is also wearing things underneath the clothing to give him the silhouette of Roald Amundsen. But the clothing that they wore, we basically copied it, and it's just stunning. I try when I make historical movies not. I put a lot of work into, of course, getting it right and getting the colors. If you want somebody to look paler and more tired, to wear grayer and clothing also, because it sort of gives you that kind of portion. If you want them to look more energetic, you can do that with color and cut and all that. But at the same time, I don't want it to be about the period. I don't want people to look at all of that. I want to shoot it as if I was only interested in the story, in a way. I want to be in there with the character and what they're into. And then, of course, it is there, but I want to. I always try to just stay with the characters and the story, if that makes sense.
It does. And with that sense of staying with the characters in the story, with the expedition scenes, I wanted to ask a little bit about the blocking and the movement with your actors in those scenes, because it's not just even the case of, okay, you know, this is how you would move with the sleds and with the dogs. You know, there's also the way that the weather impacts them, and even down to that idea of you actually don't want to move too fast because that would create more sweat, which would create liquid, which would freeze. And so there's all those tiny, minute details that actually play into the movement. So what was the journey of working with the cast and really blocking out and thinking about those elements?
No, it's so important, and of course they want that too. They want to make it as real as possible, and they read all the diaries of the crew, and we built our sets. You know, when they're in the boat that is screwed into the ice, as we say in Norwegian. I hope that's the right way to say it in English. But the whole the deck is built like this, you know, so they have to walk strangely, and it just helps, and that it is that the ceiling is really low and you have to punch yourself, and you just try to also help the actors and make everything around them as real as possible. And I love working with blocking. I think it's very interesting to also try to solve things in longer takes and make sure that everybody's part of the scene in a way. So we make these drawings and sometimes even pre-visualizations with the actors to draw it out like a bit of a dance, and then hopefully they will shake that off and then act as if it was normal. But it's great fun, and it's the physicality of it is very, very important to believe in it.
And beyond the physicality, there's also kind of the mental toll that it takes on them. You know, in those early scenes, they're all very jubilant because they're setting off to achieve something and to accomplish it. And then later on, you know, when they're living in those barracks out in the snow and they've just been there for so long following a polar bear attack, you know, there's someone who actually says, I don't want to be part of this anymore. I want to leave. I want to go home. And that really takes an emotional toll on the rest of them as well, because it feels like they start thinking about their life back home a little bit more, with the potential that someone might actually be leaving and doing just that. So how did you kind of like map out what the different trajectories were going to be in terms of the emotional headspace that these characters would be in from the impact of these experiences?
Again, we actually have the diaries, so there's a lot in there. Of course, people from that era tend to not talk about their emotions like we do, so you have to, especially men, so you have to read between the lines, and of course the fact that they do leave, even though that was a almost impossible journey back to civilization, and it didn't end that well for them either, says a lot, you know, that they're willing to take that risk, so to speak. So it was really a lot of homework, a lot of reading, a lot of hearing about their sacrifice in a way. And you know, it was really grueling, and for the families back home too, you know, with the wives and kids, and some even lost family member, even kids, when they were away. So it was quite rough, but it's really about really studying the actual stories.
Mm-hmm. And then I wanted to dive into talking about the character of Bess a little bit, who is his partner later on that we see through all those great conversations, because she's such a woman of fortitude and strength in her own right. And it's interesting as well, because she doesn't necessarily feel a need to show all of her hands and all of the experience that she has right at the beginning to prove a point. It's kind of like later on, she's just like, oh, by the way, I did this as well, so I actually do know what I'm talking about. And so I thought the way that you built her out was really interesting, and just wanted to ask about, you know, some of the research materials with her that perhaps led to the personality traits that you then infiltrated into Catherine Waterston's performance.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We could not find any interview or any sound file with Roald Amundsen, but we did find one with Bess. So there is a long interview with her online late in life where she talks about her whole life. So Roald Amundsen is like a small chapter because she did so much, and she traveled the whole planet and was part of the craziest things. And she was just so modern, I feel, for her time, and very independent and resourceful and tough, and did everything that the men did. And she would out drink and gamble with anyone, you know. So she was just a find. I was just stunned to see that he would come across such a cool lady at that time. Mm-hmm. So I think actually they were a great match. So it's such a tragedy that they didn't get to do more together than what they actually did. I think she's one of the coolest ever. So I really just wanted to, again, do her justice and show what a strong and confident woman that she was. And of course, Catherine Waterston is an amazing actress, so that made it a lot easier.
And one of the elements of Roald's accomplishment is the fact that he really was hoping for this adulation that he never really got in the way that he wanted. And one of those ways, as a British person, is that the English were not kind to him at all. And you really bring that political element into the film and think about the emotional impact that had on him and how it made him feel less of his own accomplishments. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the political aspect and how you really thought about that on such a personal level through his character.
Yes, I mean he wanted to be acknowledged so much. He wanted the world to recognize him, and he took upon a very mighty nation there, because this was the British Empire at its height, you know. Mm-hmm. And they had this huge expedition going to the Antarctic to explore and of course plant their flag and probably claim that landmass as well. And then Roald Amundsen, in a way, tricked them, because he said that he was going north, even to the Norwegians, and then he changed the course. And then when he was in Australia or something, he sent a message saying that he was joining this race. So and they were just a few men. They didn't have any much resources or anything, but of course he had the survival skills. He had studied this, so he was in a way more prepared than the British. But I think his big dream was to find land, of course, up on the North Pole, and for some reason he got a lot of he was very ridiculed, got a lot of ridicule for that. So he became, at the end of his life, he became a little bit of a joke in Norway before we sort of lifted him up again. And he didn't take it very well. He had a very big ego. He thought that he deserved better, and again, the personality, the ego that he had was what it took to accomplish these amazing things. But he was also, it made him very vulnerable in another way.
And even with that idea of the fact that all he wanted was that acknowledgement and to feel seen, at the same time, he then passes that along by not acknowledging and not seeing the work that his brother's doing. So I thought it was interesting the way that you then pulled that into their relationship. So were you thinking consciously about what the parallels were between those two dynamics, but yet they both want the same thing?
Yeah, I think it's very typical. I mean, to have a blind spot or even be sort of projecting in that kind of way. So yes, I think that's very typical. So yes, I will have it like that. Yeah.
You know, and you were talking before about obviously the cast all having access to a lot of the extensive research that you and the rest of the team did coming into the film. But what were the other ways that you worked with the cast before you went into production to make sure that they knew not just their characters, but also that they really understood the way in which you wanted to tell this story, that character study idea, and how that would impact a lot of the character choices that they were going to make as they developed who they were?
Yeah, I mean, it's several processes, but of course, going to the museum where the ship is, and going on board and being able to see where they physically were sleeping, and of course watching a lot of the documentaries, because they filmed a lot of this, so there's a lot of footage to see, and it's also about the costumes when you put them on, and you sort of start inhabiting that character. But it was a continuous dialogue, and I involve everybody in that, because you want it to be historical, but you also want it to feel relevant and feel contemporary to a certain extent. So they speak in a not a modern way, but not in a historical way either. They speak normally, but of course you need to take out the words that would give away that they're not in that time. So it's a lot of these little processes that we do as we go along that sort of build the performance.
And with moments in the film, like when they're actually watching some of the footage and showing like, okay, this is video footage of penguins, were you able to actually use any of the archival material for that, or is that a recreation of?
Yeah. That is the actual, yeah.
That's amazing. And then beyond, obviously, you know, what we were talking about earlier with all of the inclement weather in Iceland creating such a challenge, what kind of on the back end of making this film do you feel like was the biggest challenge that you had to overcome in making and telling the story?
The budget. No, it's really hard, because you know it's a silly answer, but you know, I wanted to make a really epic big movie, and at the same time there is a limited amount of money that we have to do this, and you have to think about how to spend it, and there's also a great thing about that, because it forces you to focus on the important things. So I think it forces you to focus on the characters and the emotional through line, and to get that through. And then you can't have so much, you know, circus. But it's a nice way to discipline your story and your storytelling, and then of course you have some great spectacular scenes, and then the smaller scenes are smaller, but hopefully it will feel more intimate and more interesting also in that way.
Well, congratulations on the film and overcoming the budget as well. And thank you so much for such a lovely conversation this afternoon.
Thank you. It's great. Thank you.